Good afternoon. Thanks for the Lebanese Citizen Foundation and the Norwegian Embassy for this, and Mr. Bifani for this for these two interesting days, although I did not attend yesterday. Talking about societal welfare, I think where the panelists, we have, of course, a distinguished set of panelists and discussants, which the moderator will then introduce, discussing various things: inequality, culture, and migration, and labor. And I think there is a certain thread that connects these three elements. Now, as we know, inequality ebbs and flows. The history of the 20th century in terms of what happened to inequality in advanced capitalist countries in the post-World War II period, after the neoliberal capital counter-revolution, if you want, in the 1980s, the history of that inequality and reasons and general theory, if you want, has been expanded upon by Thomas Piketty, as we all know, in the book Capital in the 21st Century. Now, in Lebanon, inequalities, I think, were shaped, we're lucky or unlucky, shaped by two financial crises: the one that started in the 1980s till the early 1990s, and the current financial and economic crisis that started in 2019. Now, these two crises had tremendous impact on inequality, on hollowing the middle class, taking out the incomes and wealth of the many, as also including, as I think Muhammad said, destruction of wealth and maybe destruction of the rentier, and also shaped by the post-war reconstruction episode. So since the 1980s, we have been living in a period with different manifestations that affected inequality in Lebanon. Now, the reconstruction period, as also was mentioned, was skewed the Lebanese economy to the interests of the rentier. The relationship between public debt, and unfortunately, Dr. Lydia Aswad will not be with us, but the relationship between public debt and the building of the Ta'if confessional state was the cornerstone of the political economic regime that we have experienced since 1992, and which led the economic crisis of 2019, but also embedded within it, before the crisis, the rise of inequality as a result of these structural changes and economic, fiscal, and monetary policies that were implemented since 1992. And with it, of course, the rise of the financial aristocracy, or as my friend Muhammad Sbeeb would call, the oligarchy, right? Very similar to what Marx analyzed of the French society in the class struggles of France and the 18th of Brumaire. We had almost a similar rise of the financial aristocracy, the banking system, the lumpen proletariat, and so on. And by the way, right, the rentier actually died or committed suicide in the crisis, right? That's something that some people may gloss over, that the crisis not only destroyed the middle class and the working class, but also destroyed the rentier and the financial aristocracy. And that's why we see that they are battling hard, right, in order to maintain their position in the economy and, of course, in politics. So we see inequalities, whether in Lebanon or around the world, are complex and non-linear, and in different periods manifest themselves differently. So we have the hollowing, right, of the middle strata in Lebanon of society, of the middle class and the working class. And here just a footnote maybe. relation to what was spoken earlier regarding the financial losses and so on. Now we see that there is a concentration, right, on the financial losses of the dollar depositors. But we should be talking about what happened to the Lebanese pound depositors and the workers and the pensioners and the would-be pensioners. There was a huge redistribution of wealth and income as a result of the crisis, and limiting the discussion, the political, economic discussion, to the losses in the financial sector, right, is totally wrong at this time in history. How does that relate also to culture? Right? We know inequality increases the populist elements in society. The rise of right-wing populism, racism, xenophobia, ethnic strife is a result of inequality. And I think we, as a cosmopolitan, as many people maybe alluded to but did not mention it, right? As a cosmopolitan culture that we have in Lebanon, will suffer as a result of the rise of inequality, with the rise of ethnic and confessional politics again. So that's also how we should view inequality. It's not only an economic issue, it's not only about wealth or inequality of income, but also how it affects politics. And we see that in Europe, and we saw it tremendously in a stark fashion in the United States with the rise of the right and the Trump administration. Finally, on migration and labor, I think migration in Lebanon has always worked as a safety valve for the economic system. And that's not peculiar to Lebanon. Some people think that this is peculiar to Lebanon. I mean, Europe in the 19th century, the migration to the United States was also a safety valve for some of the European economies after the 1848 springtime of the peoples, as mentioned by the renowned Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm. So Lebanon, yes, we've seen this migration, and we've seen it. Somebody mentioned that. I think Dr. Haraki from the World Bank, when he was discussing the paper by the excellent presentation by Dr. Diwan, that we have a migration of the skilled labor, and any future economic model will have to deal with that. Finally, something also that we think the migration of skilled labor, right, whether you think it's positive or negative, I think it has created a dual economy in Lebanon, and is very much related to the question of inequality. Skilled labor getting higher income in GCC countries or in Europe, while unskilled labor or less skilled labor remaining in Lebanon, the income widens between the two parts of the labor force. Essentially, since around 1/3 of the labor force, we're not talking about the migration, let's say, or the few Americans or British who are living in the GCC relative to the economy of the UK or the US. But around 1/3 of the Lebanese labor force gets its income from foreign economies, which causes this dual economy, and it has a lot of ramifications, including macroeconomic ramifications, but that's not our discussion here. It has a lot of ramifications on inequality of income and wealth in the country, and that's something also that we should be looking at. So without further ado, we start the session, and hopefully it will be a fruitful session on the different aspects probably of the same problem that Lebanon is facing as a result of this catastrophic financial and economic crisis that we are passing through. And thank you very much.
Thank you for our chairman for this panel, Mr. Diba. If you can have a seat on the stage, that would be great. We will proceed now introducing the first sessionist, the author of the paper called Culture, Arts and Heritage, Mrs. Anne-Marie Maila-Affesh. Mrs. Affesh is the CEO and General Director of the General Council of Museums in Lebanon, MA holder in History, Archaeology from the University of Aix-en-Provence, and diploma from École de Louvre. She is supervising the National Museum of Beirut since 2009, Director of the Museography display between 2014 and 2016, contributor in the restitution of stolen artifacts to Lebanon in 2017. Mrs. Affesh is previous editor-in-chief of the Bulletin d'Archéologie et d'Architecture Libanaise, the annual scientific journal of the Ministry of Culture. She is prolific publisher of which the most recent, the National Museum Guidebook. Mrs. Anne-Marie Affesh is an award holder of the Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres and the distinction of the Ufficiale dell'Ordine della Stella d'Italia. Welcome, Mrs. Affesh. I would like to remind you that the sessions will be streamed over Zoom and our social media platform, and the author papers are published on the Citizen Foundation website. The discussant of Mrs. Affesh will be Mr. Nadeem Shamas, executive, consultant and coach in fashion, beauty, and other creative industries. Nadeem Shamas is involved in the fashion and creative scene in Lebanon since 2005, former general manager of Elise Saab and head of operations at Façonnable. He is the founder and GM of Fashion Next Door and executive coach in the creative industry and a mentor at Endeavour Lebanon. Nadeem is also active in the film and theater scenes as a screenwriter and an actor. He is a board member of Metropolis, manager of Metropolis Cinema, and co-founder of Creal. Nadeem owns a degree in economics from Louvain University, an MBA from HEC Paris, a master in fashion management from EFM Paris, and certificate in professional and executive coaching from University of Texas in Dallas. I would like to welcome both of you and remind our attendees of the ground rules of our session. Our session will be for 40 minutes, so we'll give the author 15 minutes to tell us more about the paper, and then 6 to 7 minutes for our discussant, and then we'll take questions from the chairman, the public, and the online attendees. The floor is yours, Mr. Affesh.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the Lebanese Citizen Foundation, the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Beirut, and the Institute of Political Science at St. Joseph University for inviting me to participate in this distinguished forum. The paper I'm presenting today is entitled Culture, Arts and Heritage. It is based on my personal experience in the specific cultural fields where I have been working for more than 20 years, and thus it reflects only a modest part of the overall cultural scene in Lebanon. In the early 1990s, as a young archaeologist, I took part in the rehabilitation process of the National Museum of Beirut, which was severely damaged during the Civil War. That early experience, followed by 2 decades of ascertaining and understanding our cultural roots in building our identity as a unique and distinct people. And now, as a front row witness of of the degradation, I would say, of some archaeological artifacts and to the neglect of several valuable national monuments, I note painfully the serious threats of losing the legacy of our distant and rich past if we fail to rise to this challenge and if no corrective action is taken soon. Thankfully, however, years dedicated to a variety of reconstruction, rehabilitation, and restoration projects also taught me that awareness of and education about our cultural heritage are key success factors in safeguarding it. So I remain hopeful that the threats can be countered and permanent losses prevented or minimized, let's say, if we can rebuild broad-based support for our heritage in both the public sector and society at large. In the past few years, the National Museum was presented as an example or a case study of safeguarding a unique legacy in time of crisis, while addressing the key issues involved in protecting it in conflict areas and during challenging times. How do archaeologists and museum curators actually safeguard their collections? How do they engage in the process of reviving them after the crisis? Learning from these difficult episodes, what are the best ways to preserve these collections for future generations? The experience with our National Museum over the past decades highlights not only the importance of emergency preparedness, but also points at strategy, funding, commitment, ethics, and leadership as essential ingredients. Today, in the midst of the terrible collapse Lebanon has been experiencing since 2019, what is the place given to culture? The crisis has underlined the fragility of this sector at a time when economic, financial, and social issues are the obvious priorities. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating double explosion in the port of Beirut on August 4, 2020, have delivered serious blows to the capital, to the country, and to its culture. In this context of widespread failure, the Lebanese people are fighting for survival, struggling every day to find a way to earn a living for their family, and somehow trying to adapt to the worst crisis Lebanon has faced in a century. At such difficult time, how can we at least counter and hopefully reverse the severe decline in the priority accorded to the cultural sector in the country? My paper addresses three groups of questions. First, what is cultural heritage? And what specifically are we talking about here? Second, who is in charge of Lebanon's cultural heritage? And what are the main laws and regulations relevant to this field? Three, what are the key financial and non-financial issues facing the sector? What about the roles of the private funding and of international support? A brief reminder first. In its broadest definition, cultural heritage refers to sites, monuments, historic buildings, artistic representation, and artifacts often preserved in museums and exhibited in museums, in galleries, and in private collections. It encompasses also artistic creations and industries, music, cinema, visual and performing arts, and literature. And accordingly, cultural heritage connotes our way of life, as well as our common system of knowledge, beliefs, values, and behaviors. My focus in the paper is especially on our tangible heritage, and more particularly on the way it is perceived by Lebanese society and managed by the public sector at this time. On that basis, some lines of inquiry emerge for our discussion. Is our heritage insufficiently known, or is it perhaps misunderstood within the country? Could these be the reasons for the lack of priority and respect it receives at home? How severe are the threats to Lebanon's heritage today, and what can be done to counter and reverse these threats? As the title of this forum is Lebanon Looking Forward, so I would offer the following forward-looking comments to get our discussion going. 4 points. First, encouraging people to frequent the art sector is not enough. What is needed is a far greater support from national and local authorities within the framework of a coherent long-term cultural strategy for the country. 2, despite the recent laws regulating the Ministry of Culture and its affiliated institutions, there is no comprehensive plan for the management of our national heritage, one which takes into consideration Lebanon's cultural diversity, nor is there adequate enforcement of existing laws and regulation applicable to all players operating in the sector. 3, while there have been recent efforts at decentralization as well as several private initiatives that started many years ago to promote festivals in the regions, the government has failed to establish cultural centers, cinema performance theaters, galleries, arts and crafts hubs, and active libraries, especially in the regions and in rural areas. 4, sound governance is sorely lacking at several levels, as are appropriate incentives and facilities for artists, practitioners, and students engaged in cultural and creative activities. Greater and more widespread respect for culture as a priority is a prerequisite for the significant enhancement needed in the governance practices of several organizations. May I conclude this introduction by quoting the Reverend Selim Dakkash. In a recent speech on the occasion of the construction of the BIMA, the Beirut Modern Art Museum, Rector Dakkash said, and I quote the words he expressed in French, quelqu'un dirait, est-ce un moment propice au cœur de cette crise multiforme pour que la première pierre du musée d'art contemporain de Beyrouth soit posée? N'est-il pas préférable de dépenser de l'argent pour l'enseignement, l'éducation, la santé et l'hospitalisation? Comme ces questions ont une résonance, une sincérité et une franchise dans les arts en général et dans l'art de la peinture et du dessin, il y a une créativité et une création, un dépassement vers le sublime et une sortie de la crise, même si ça exige la prise en considération des besoins fondamentaux. Le travail acharné de la raison politique et sociale requiert également et surtout la créativité artistique, car cette créativité ne fait que peindre la réalité telle qu'elle est et oriente le regard de la personne vers la vision de construire l'avenir. Elle était et sera toujours la composante essentielle de l'entité libanaise. End of quote. So on that inspiring note, I look forward to your comments and our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Afesh. Mr. Shamas, the floor is yours.
Hello. Yes. Thank you, Madam Afesh, for this nice paper. Thank you first for to the Lebanese Citizen Foundation, to the Norwegian Embassy and University Saint Joseph for giving me the pleasure to attend. Hello. First, happy birthday for the National Museum. I think we celebrated 3 days ago the 85th anniversary, so that's good news. Inshallah. So I recommend to all the participants, to the attendants who didn't have the time to read the paper of Madame Afesh, to do so. It's available, I think, on the website of the Lebanese Citizen Foundation. It's a great paper, and I think you've explained to us the achievement that you have been able to accomplish in this position, despite the very low funding available. I think you mentioned in this paper that the funding of the ministry, the budget of the ministry is 0.24% of the total national budget, which is a fourth of the minimum recommended by UNESCO. which is 1%. So congratulations for this achievement. So I would like to continue a little bit and share from my perspective and my modest experience on the side of the creative industries, what in my opinion could or should be done in order to move forward and to look forward, as you have mentioned. So looking forward, I think that we need two things. We need less government interference from one side and more state on the other side, and I will explain why. So first is obviously, in my opinion, less government interference. On one side, which is on the soft part of the heritage. Okay, so on all the artistic creation and these industries. I'm talking about not only fashion, design, craftsmanship, but also performing acts, film, theater, gaming, food, etc. As a practitioner in this sector, we always see the same pattern from our government. So it's either the rules that are applicable are ancestral, to say the least. Either we have some good rules that are applied but are an issue and doesn't allow the development of our activity, or we have simply a random application of some rules. Just to give some examples. In the fashion industry, when we import goods, do you know that if you want to import goods legally, not, I say legally, and I insist on that point, your invoice have to be signed in blue ink. Okay, so we spend our time in our company in fashion sending to our suppliers, your invoice have to be signed by blue ink because the government doesn't recognize the black inking. And if you have an invoice without a stamp, you know a stamp, it is rejected by the customs. So just to give an example, and this applies to fashion, craftsmanship. And again, this can look as minor, but it is a serious obstacle for the development of our industries. We need to know on which basis our industry can work. We need to have a normal cost in importing goods, if ever we are allowed to import goods in the future. A small parenthesis compared to the economic presentation that has been done before. It is impossible for almost impossible for any of the creative industry in the future to perform if we don't have a minimum of imported raw material or finished products to our country. So I close the parenthesis. So when it comes to fashion, design, and beauty, we've experienced many obstacles in performing our business. Now, on the arts side, the biggest issue is, of course, censorship. As you all know, you have to go and have, okay, so if you write a play, so you invent a character, you write his line, and then you have to go to an office where someone decides if the line that you've just wrote is acceptable or not. So obviously censorship in this way or control of the speech is impossible when you want to have efficient performing arts. Movies have to be approved. I can share with you many stories where if you have a sheikh passing on or a priest with a half-naked woman, this wouldn't be allowed, and the director has to reshoot this scene just because it is not good. So the way this censorship law is applied is of course, an obstacle also for the development of the performing arts. And I don't mention, of course, the indirect censorship that we can live with pressure groups, such as religious pressure groups. I think we all remember the Mashru' Layla story that has nothing to do with law, but only pressure. So from one side, I think that we need to have less government and less interference from our government when it comes to art and culture. On the other, and I mean, why do we recommend that? We recommend that not only for the beauty and not for protecting our business. First, because the creative industries create value to the economy, one. Secondly, they have a high added value, so they need a minimum import of raw material, but you have a high added value which gives value to the economy. Our industry, I mean, these industries employ a lot of people. So today it was estimated to around 6%, but according to the study of the Institut de Finance, the actual direct and indirect people living from the creative industry is around 20%, which is huge. Of course, all the creative industry participate to the development of the brand name Lebanon abroad. I'm sure that Khalil Gibran or Nadine Labaki has done much better to our brand name Lebanon than other Gibran or other people or other politicians. And finally, on a pure economic point of view, I mean, this could be a huge flow of effects to our country. Tourism, not only creative industry, but tourism, just to give an example, tourism in Jordan brought in 2019 $6 billion. Okay. So it's not only creative industry, but you can imagine what is the potential if you are able to unleash not only the creative part of that, but also the second part, which is as you said, Madam Fish, the tangible part of the tangible part. Now I go to the second part. So from one side, less government interference, in my opinion, and then from the second side, more state involvement in the tangible part of the heritage, as you just mentioned. So in your paper, you have a description of the heritage, and I picked up another one, which is from Françoise Choet, which mentions, and it's a free translation, that heritage is the assets, a group of assets meant for the fulfillment of a community, extended to planetary dimension. So when I just start with these few words, meant for the fulfillment of a community, I mean, that struck me. It means that we need to have a public sector and we need to have a state. One, to organize these assets, and second, to make them available to the public. Okay, so if you have a heritage, we need to have a public sector, again, I'm repeating myself, to organize these assets and then to make them available to the audience or to the community. And then, I mean, when we look at the last 20 years, in my opinion, or 30 years, in my opinion, the only movement that is very clear in many sectors is the opposite of that, is the privatization of our country. Okay, and I noticed that it was a subject that was raised yesterday. Dr. Brahim Werde mentioned to us how since the beginning, and when the former President Hariri came in power, and with the Solidaire project, the whole idea was to have no money from the public sector and everything privatized, no debt for Lebanon. This is what Dr. Werde mentioned to us. And Madam Mona Fawaz mentioned also how the real estate and the land has been financed, I don't know, I mean, taken into the financial sphere and taken out from the public sector. So this trend of privatization seems to me an issue, because it's impossible to have a heritage. It's impossible, in my opinion, to protect, nurture, and develop our heritage without a strong public sectors. And if we look back at the last years, public space is shrinking, seaside is occupied, historic buildings taken away, very few public initiatives in museum, except the Modern Art Museum and the renovation, of course. But yeah, you mentioned in your paper, so we have very few one, or at least they have been done with the support of France, Italy, Greece, and Germany, and to some extent to the private sector. But there is no real commitment of the government. We have some sites such as the Grotto Jeita who are literally privatized, who have been literally privatized, so taken away from the public sphere. And of course, on the private sector, we have a large number of masterpieces who are owned today by private people, which is also something that we need as independent and as citizens to question ourselves. Is the place of these pieces in our homes? I mean, this is something that we need to think about. So we cannot. So I repeat, we cannot in a sustainable way protect, nurture, and develop our heritage without an impartial state who could organize this fund and make it available to the public. And finally, I mean, culture, as Dr. Diba mentioned, it could be an excellent way to open up to other subjects and important ones. I open a small parenthesis here about the monuments. I was questioning myself, and I was trying to remember how many monuments our governments during the last 30 years have established in the country. And I don't know, just a monument, I don't think I remember anything that have been done. So I made a small research, and I'm no wonder why. So monuments come from monere, which means from the Latin, which means warns and reminds. So monuments challenges our memory or our remembrance. And Françoise Chouet give this, it's a small moment of poetry, allow me, give this very nice words about monuments. She says, it's a free translation, that the monument is a protection against the trauma of existence. A monument is a safety device. The monument assures, reassures, calms down by averting humans from time. The monument is the guardian of our pasts, and it calms the anxiety generated by the uncertainty of new beginnings. The monument recalls the past by making it vibrate like the present. So the monument recalls the past by making it vibrate like the present. So no wonder that some of our rulers were not interested at all by establishing new monuments in our country. So in conclusion, let's state our view, our take on that point. Let's take for the cultural and artistic activities a solid state with a good governance for the heritage and the tangible assets. And finally, culture as a tool, first to create value and employment, to bring effects, and finally, hopefully, to open a discussion at the level of our country about our past and our history. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Mr. Shamas. Mrs. Asfish, I believe you have a few things to say to reply to. It's fine. You wanted to tell something, June.
No, when you were talking about the museums, and yes, there was in the last 10 years, there were a lot of new initiatives to create new museums. So national museums, I'm talking about a museum that will be under the governance of the Ministry of Culture. So a part of the National Museum of Beirut, we do have a few museums, national museums, that are within the sites, like Baalbek Museum, which is a site museum, Byblos Museum, Tripoli in the Citadel, and Beit Eddin. Now, there were many new projects for museums, one in Tyre and one in Beirut. In Beirut, downtown Beirut, just in front of the Nahar building. And this museum was supposed to be the museum of history, of the history of Beirut, that would have included the whole new discoveries that the archaeologists realized the last, between the early 1990s until 1998. So all these artifacts, objects, but also all the documentation that archaeologists were able to collect during these years of excavations, we were supposed to host them in a beautiful museum, and the funding came from the Kuwaiti fund, and we were supposed to start the creation of this museum as the architect with, of course, the municipality of Beirut, the CDR, Solidaire, and of course the Ministry of Culture. The whole collection is still here, of course, and the whole idea of creating a museum is still here. And even the plan were done by the famous architect Renzo Piano. So everything was in place, let's say, to start the creation of, and I'm talking about national museum, these national museums. Next to these national museums, we had, of course, beautiful private museums during the last 10 years and more. Okay, I will not count them all, but I talked about the BIMA, which is the future Beirut Modern Art Museum, which will be just next to the MIM Museum, both of them being in the University St. Joseph area, in the same parcel, let's say, in the same lot.
Thank you, Mr. Hafish, for clarifying this point. Concerning the museum, there is a question. Are you planning on restarting the initiative of the Night of the Museums? If yes, what are the challenges that you might face?
Yes, so the Night of the Museum is an initiative and a beautiful activity that we started 7 years ago. And it was, we realized that us in the museums, we had to invite the society and the people, and to say the museum is not here just as a monument, cold and empty. It needs people, it needs, this is a place where you can feel the social cohesion, you can feel that this is an inclusive museum. All museums should be inclusive and open to the public. This is in the definition of a museum. The museum is an open space at the service of the society. So this initiative of the Nuit des Musées started, and we realized the first year we had about 2,000 people, 3,000 people, and the last year, which was in 2018, we had more than 10,000 people between 5 o'clock and 12 o'clock. And then we enlarged, of course, it was not only the National Museum, but all the Museum of Lebanon, which wanted to participate and to take part to this big feast. It was an event, but it was also a way to celebrate culture, to celebrate the collections that are within these museums, and that usually people do not know, I must say. And so it was a way to invite them to come and discover their own heritage. This belongs to all Lebanese people and to all people. So this was a way to invite them, and that's why it had so much success. This year, we were thinking of it, of course, but within, these difficult conditions, as we do not have electricity in the museum, and we have to open only a few hours instead of the 9 to 5. Today, we are opening only from 10 to 2. So it was very difficult, and especially we thought it was not a nice idea to say to people, come and enjoy yourself in a museum when people are struggling for their living. So we will do it eventually, as soon as we can, as soon as we can offer them all this for free.
Thank you. I would love to take questions from the public, if anyone has any question.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this beautiful presentation. My question relates to, in fact, schools. Do you go, because culture starts with small kids, huh? Do you go to schools and do they come send you classes that visit museum, etc.?
Yes, we do. We used to. It's been a few years that it's different, and especially because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Things stopped at its level, but we were not the only one. 90% of worldwide museums closed their doors between 2019 and 2021. The schools, yes, it's a very important. We have like a program. We used to have a program with schools, and usually on Wednesdays we used to have people coming with special guides that are here to welcome them and to explain things differently. So these students have a different experience in museum, to show them that the museum is not something cold or empty, or it is enjoyable. You can learn, but you can play also, and you can discover a lot of things. So yes, we have been working hard on these visits. A lot of associations were here to help us in this. I think of Biladi, which is an association that has developed very special programs for schools. And Biladi was able to get funding for these visits.
Thank you. Okay, another question from my side concerning the censorship that you've talked about, Mr. Shamas. So, in your opinion, and as well for Mrs. Afesh, in your opinion, what is the role that the expert and the civil society can play in advocating for a change on this censorship law to ensure that we're having more culture or concert or movies accepted within the society? What role can they play?
The first role is to go and vote and for electing people who can change the laws. And the second is really pressure. And again, the idea is not as a state, there are no limits. There are, of course, public concern, and it is the role of a state to protect the public, enfin, l'ordre public, donc, so the public rules of a country. The idea is just to avoid avoid all the uncertainties that goes around it, because it really doesn't make sense and it's absurd. It gives a very bad image about our country. Just to talk about, I mean, the whole thing about when you have Jewish names, authors or movies with Jewish names. Okay, sometimes they're accepted, sometimes they're not. Okay, I'm very happy that no one digged into Sigmund Freud's family or Marcel Proust, because otherwise they would be wiped out. I mean, so it's really embarrassing at a point. And I think it's very important that the public society voice out and say that no discrimination is allowed. And if the government and the state would like to set up rules, let them be clear rules. And with an independent justice, this can work like any other country.
Great, thank you. Mr. Diba?
I just have I think it's the necessity for a new economic or social model in Lebanon that Dr. Ishaq Diwan talked about, especially when he mentioned on what basis do we build this new economic model based on digitalization, services, and so on. I think you mentioned, Mr. Shamas, gaming. So I think that links very much with what is needed, because the post-1992 economic model that was also mentioned was very austere, if you want, with regard to culture, creativity, the spread of, let's say, cinemas, theater. These issues were not given any, if not even the least priority in the post-war reconstruction period. So I think when we think about, after the current crisis, about a new economic model, of course it's also a new social model, and we're talking about societal welfare, a new cultural model, a new model in which we really harness the creative potential and capabilities of the Lebanese people. And that's how things, I think, come together. Maybe we need really, because we don't want the discussion of culture and creativity to be a fringe element. We need a certain cultural, maybe revolution, right, or intifada in the culture, right, in order to have a new economic and political model. And of course, would love to hear your opinion on that.
Just to confirm what you're saying, Dr. Diba, which is very important. I mean, most of the creative industry have also this specificity that they have many. They employ a lot of people in different areas. Just to take fashion. In fashion, you need to have the thread, you need to have the fabric manufacturer, you need to have the retail stores, you need to have people who sew. You produce packaging, you do transportation, but then again you have people to shoot, so you have photographer, you have editors, you have IT people who work on editing and saving the pictures, and then you have press, journalists. So if you have one successful fashion brand, it's like 12 or 13 sectors that could live around it. On top of that, Lebanon has a fantastic asset, which is it's a small country. So if you compare to some other areas, it's extremely convenient to have, except for the cost of transportation, but it's still extremely convenient to have these activities being split if you have the right infrastructure. So we could very well have sewing being done in an area and the packaging being done in a third area and the labeling being done in a third one, photography in Tripoli and then editing in Jizin. That's not an issue. So having this network of businesses around us is something very easy to be done in Lebanon. And you are right. This is a typical good industry to invest on, in my opinion. However, and again, I don't know if someone from the FMI is here, it's impossible to do it if you don't have a minimum of importation. So if you cannot import a minimum of our raw material, it's impossible to do anything, except maybe literature, but that's very, very, very limited.
Thank you so much. If we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank our chairman, Mrs. Afesh and Mr. Shamas, and we will move to our next session for this panel. The second topic, thank you. The second topic for this panel is migration and labor, with the author of the paper, Dr. Rula Abi Habib Khouri, who will be joining us over Zoom. Dr. Khouri is a professor of sociology and director of the Centre d'études pour le monde arabe moderne at USG, director of the Centre d'études pour le monde arabe moderne in Beirut, previous chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, St. Joseph University in Beirut between 2008 and 2017. Dr. Rula is a prolific researcher in sociological theory, political sociology, and the sociology of Lebanese society. She will be discussed on her paper by Mrs. André Waiter. Mrs. André is a European Migration Liaison Officer for Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan in the European Commission. She holds 2 MAs in philosophy and German literature, as well as interdisciplinary European studies. Mrs. Waiter possesses extensive experience as well as knowledge in international protection and migration in international frameworks. She will be discussing Dr. Abi Habib Khouri's paper titled Migration and Labor. Same as the previous session, I would like to assure that all of the papers will be uploaded on the website of the Citizen Foundation. And we will give 15 minutes for the author to present her paper, and then it will be followed by 6 to 7 minutes discussion by the discussant, and it will be followed by questions from the public and online over Zoom. Mrs. Khouri, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by thanking the organizers for this very interesting conference and by apologizing for delivering my presentation online since I'm out of town. The theme that was initially proposed to me for this paper was migration and employment. On the invitation, it says migration and labor, which is not exactly the same thing. In both cases, however, I am supposed to analyze the impact of migration on some aspects of the Lebanese economy. Coming from a sociology background and taking advantage of the fact that both terms of the equation, migration and employment or labor, are hazy and ill-defined in the Lebanese context, I shall take the subject on yet another terrain, that of imagined economy, which is defined as the collectively held system of mostly imprecise ideas and beliefs about economy, and the concrete effects of this ideation or this imagination on actions and opinions. My paper is in fact part of an ongoing reflection on how the Lebanese, being weakly connected to objective economic facts, are used to measure, imagine, or sense the state of health of their economy, and on the factors to which they attribute the past economic successes and the present economic failure. In other words, Instead of analyzing facts and figures of the structure of the domestic economy, facts and figures which are already scarce and constantly debated, and which I would leave to the prominent economists joining us on this panel, I maintain that any policy implementation seeking to re-engineer the economy and therefore to transform society should stem from a deep understanding of how economy is initially imagined. In the present context, we should look into the ways the Lebanese tend to visualize the series of connections linking migration to economy by inserting local power relations and regional considerations as major mediator variable to understand economy. Of course, there are different imaginaries within a given society, and even more so within the Lebanese society, because actually the Lebanese society is one where belonging is very important. We talk about belonging to a community, belonging to a rural society, an urban society. We're talking about social class. But of course, talking about different imaginaries goes beyond the scope of a 7-page article or a 15 minutes presentation. Hence my attempt to condense my analysis of only 3 representations linked to 3 categories of migrants or refugees. Then again, here I cannot do a lot of distinctions because I would need additional 30 minutes to do so. So I will talk about how the Lebanese represent, or how do they perceive, the 3 categories of migrants or refugees, namely the Palestinians, the Syrians, and the domestic workers coming from Asia or from Africa. And I will do so in order to underline the difficulty to transition to an economy where we can denationalize the approach to migration, and also the approach to nationality, to insertion or to assimilation. And actually, I would like to pinpoint the difficulty to think only in terms of market needs. So my point is that migration is still an economic threat in Lebanon, despite the fact that a lot of rationalization has been going on. And despite the fact that we have been listening to a lot of discourses saying that the fear of migration is actually a fear-induced misconception derived from the notion of imagined economy. So basically, a lot of people would say that migration has no direct effect on employment, and that this is only the fruit of our imagination, since actually we have never been discussing economy as we should have. We have never been discussing the structure of employment in Lebanon. We don't know how this structure works. So if we are not addressing the dysfunctions of the employment policies to start with, we cannot attribute our failure in this domain to the sole presence of a lot of migrants on the Lebanese soil. So this way of looking at things is actually very present today on the Lebanese scene, but it does not affect the other discourse, which is really adamant and which considers that a huge number of migrants on the Lebanese soil is, one way or another, a very important threat to the economy. But then again, I will not discuss facts and figures. And if my first hypothesis is that in order to understand migration, we should understand imaginary or imagined economy, my second hypothesis is that the policy making in present Lebanon concerning migration does not really benefit from theories of migration that are discussed today worldwide. What I'm trying to say is that the theories of migration are evolving today in a diametrically opposed direction to the national trajectory. In fact, these theories are sliding along the continuum from the most rigid state-based approach using biopolitics to the most ethereal conceptions of national identity and national boundaries. Needless to say that Lebanon is still positioning migration at the intersection of the three pillars of governmentality, which are economy, order, and humanitarianism. And Lebanon is still viewing migration as a security issue, linked to unemployment, linked to crime, and linked to what we call today identity politics, on a very exiguous territory, struggling to control its border and desperately trying to rebuild itself. So the otherwise very much appealing theories promoting nomadic societies, talking about how people should be free to move within space, free to settle wherever they see fit, is actually not very fruitful, let's say, when approaching the Lebanese reality. In fact, I have been working on these theories for a long time, since 2015, because, you know, sociology also has moved from the idea that order and functionality should be the main concerns of societies, and we have moved to a view of society where things have become very much liquid, where people do not own space, where people are scattered within space, and where belonging has been replaced by becoming, actually. But these theories I have worked on for a long time do not really apply to the Lebanese context. Hence, my hypothesis that any policy making would not really benefit from these theories. My third hypothesis in this paper is based on extensive field work conducted between 2017 and 2020, a period during which I worked on the perception that the Lebanese have of the migrants, whether they be Palestinian, Syrian, or Asian or African domestic workers in Lebanon. And I have conducted a lot of interviews in Beirut, in Mount Lebanon, and in the central part of the Pact, in order to understand how the refugee crisis in Syria affected the Lebanese population. And the hypothesis that I clearly stated from this fieldwork is that the migration scene in Lebanon will not witness huge changes in the near future, and the only change that we have by the current economic crisis. And I will make myself clear as I go about the three categories of refugees / migrants that are in Lebanon. So I will be brief, but I would like to talk about the Palestinians to start with. Of course, the controversy over the Palestinian presence in Lebanon is a huge subject. The numbers of Palestinians in Lebanon are sometimes abated, sometimes inflated, and this only has to be analyzed from a sociological point of view. Of course, the Palestinians are marginalized in Lebanon. Of course, they do not have access to a lot of professions, to property, to social protection. But actually, the Palestinian issue in Lebanon is a political one. So we have to consider it from a political angle, where the image of the Palestinian roughly oscillates between two opposites. On the one hand, you can consider the Palestinians as an inoffensive population, victim of forcible displacement, and a population who has the right to decent living and eventually to citizenship. And on the other hand, some other people would look at the Palestinians as belligerent groups searching for a substitute country, a threat to the delicate confessional equilibrium in Lebanon, should tawteen or naturalization or assimilation occur. And amidst this ambivalence of the Palestinian in Lebanon, the very notion of camp and the notion also of the right of return are constantly reinterpreted by the Lebanese. So camps are simultaneously seen as structures that isolate the Palestinians and keep them at bay, or as spaces of poverty and desolation calling for humanitarian action, or as a ticking bomb, a home for sleeper cells waiting to be instrumentalized. And the right of return becomes a versatile slogan, sometimes used to uphold the justice of the Palestinian cause, and more often used as an excuse for not granting the Palestinians their rights, since they should be leaving. So the Palestinian presence in Lebanon is highly political, and any solution on this front is most probably a political solution. The Syrian migrant is a little bit ubiquitous compared to the Palestinian refugee, who is really confined within the camps. We have, at least I'm talking a non-official number of 1.5 million Syrian refugees on the Lebanese soil. Of course, the Syrian presence in Lebanon preceded the war. We have always had Syrian workers in Lebanon and what we used to call cheap labor. And of course, this the idea. The image of the Syrian worker has changed over time with the Syrian intervention, military intervention in Lebanon. But up until the outbreak of the war in Syria, the Lebanese antagonism, let's say, towards their neighbor and their way of considering the migrant, the Syrian migrant or the Syrian refugee, would manifest in two different ways. One way, I would call it with using Balibar and Wallerstein's concept. One way the Lebanese look at the Syrian is called an auto-referential prejudice, in the sense that the Lebanese tend to consider sometimes themselves as superior to their Arab neighbors. Another way of looking at the Syrian is what we would call a heterophobic racism, which stems from the nationalism of the dominated, since Syria has occupied Lebanon from 1976 to 2005. And the way we considered the Syrian is actually changing over time. And amidst the Syrian refugee crisis, it has become customary to distinguish two kinds of Syrians, or at least the Assad regime, let's say, and the Syrian population, which is considered by part of the Lebanese population as the hostage of the regime. So it has become a moral injunction today to speak about the Syrian population on one hand and the Syrian regime on the other hand, in such a way that the Syrian has become some kind of, using Emile Durkheim's way of saying things, a duplex being, a duplex Syrian. And this way of considering the Syrian actually was really very much clear when the popular upheaval of October 2019 started, where people on the streets started welcoming the refugees, unlike 2005, when the Syrian army was leaving Lebanon and where the slogan was Syria out. So today it's as if the Lebanese have developed some kind of newfound hospitality towards the Syrians. This newfound hospitality actually should be discussed, because I don't know if it's still the same. I have ended my field work in 2020 before the explosion of the port. I think that additional field work should be done in order to understand if the way people see Syrians is the same. Before I talk about the domestic migrant workers, I should say that before the explosion of the port, and in most, at least in 90% of the testimonies I have collected, The image of the Syrian was really very much ambivalent. On the one hand, people were welcoming, and on the other hand, they could not understand why European countries, or the European countries mainly, would help the Syrians, whereas the Lebanese are in deep crisis and they are the ones who need help. So in the paper, you can read it. You can read it online. I have many excerpts of testimonies that have gone this way, and which are not really very welcoming to the Syrian population. So the Syrian problem is also a political one, and I don't think that a mere policy approach would give us solutions, not on the Palestinian, not on the Syrian front at least. So as I was saying, when I talked about my third hypothesis, the domestic migrant workers are the only the population, let's say, which is being affected, of course, negatively by what's happening in Lebanon. But it's the only area of sociological interest where change is really taking place. And I said that it's not because of advocacy that this is taking place, because there are a lot of associations of NGOs who stress on the vulnerability of this population, who actually denounce the sponsorship system, the kafala system, who talk about racism, about passport confiscation. And I do acknowledge that these things exist and that there is a very important physical but also symbolic violence that is actually which is exercised on this population. But there is something that the economic crisis has done, and which is really very much interesting on the socio-economic level. It's that the situation has kickstarted something by actually ejecting this population out of the employment structure. I know that ejection is a negative word, but by ejecting them, actually the Lebanese society is now obliged to rethink a lot of concepts and a lot of ways of considering life, which they couldn't do with the presence of those domestic workers. To be even clearer, today the domestic work is subjected to the laws of supply and demand, because you cannot pay any person to come and clean your house and give them a very low wage. So basically, when these people left our market, actually let's say the consequences of their leaving is that we have today to redefine what do we understand by comfort, what do we understand by privilege, what is work, what is domestic work, how do we define, how do we rethink women's work, how do we rethink childcare. We should also reconsider our way of understanding feminism, because I don't know if you have seen caricatures about the domestic workers in Lebanon, where, for instance, I couldn't find it. There is a domestic worker from Sri Lanka holding a panel saying, "Madam wants her rights," let's say. So how do we understand today work? How do we understand normalizing family relations? How do we understand also racism? And aren't we today obliged to amend our laws, especially our laws of maternity leave, paternity leave? Why not? Because actually the employment structure has completely been modified by the departure of these domestic workers. And Yes, I will conclude by saying that actually nobody has ever thought about. We always discuss the kafalas, the sponsorship system, and we always decry the violence over these people. But nobody has ever discussed their right to nationality, because I think that a Sri Lankan woman who has had children in Lebanon, who has been here for 20 years, deserves at least the Lebanese nationality. But the very idea of not discussing it shows us that the only thing that's important for the Lebanese is the Palestinian and the Syrian presence, because it's political and because it is linked to what Sigmund Freud calls the narcissism of small differences. It's because we are a bit alike between Palestinians and Syrians that actually there is this feud between us. Whereas the domestic workers are complete strangers. We do not even consider them as seeking our nationality. So basically, can we denationalize the approach to migration? My answer would be very disenchanting, and it would be that I don't believe so, at least not in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khouri. We will be listening now to Mrs. Waiter and her feedback on that.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting me to this panel, and thank you, Dr. Khouri, for the interesting presentation. Among the concepts that you mentioned at the beginning of the intervention, the notion of borders as negotiated realities caught my attention, because it means that the nature of a border, I mean, what it implies for the people living on both sides of it, and what the effect it has on their lives and activities, can be subject to negotiations and can be adapted to new policy challenges. Or let's say that policies can define what a border means for people willing to cross them, for example, to find employment opportunities. Well, as I'm not yet that long in Lebanon, and I'm sure each one of you knows more about this country than I do, and since the title of the panel is Migration and Labor, I would like to expose briefly how the EU deals with borders and migration in the context of labor. And the main reason for people to settle somewhere or to leave the place are generally the availabilities of work, products and services. And since they were and still are not evenly distributed within the EU, the political leaders decided to let people move freely within the member states. And in 1992, the Maastricht Treaty established the free movement of people, alongside of the free movement of goods, services and capital within the European Union. These negotiations led to a signature of the treaty, redefined the meaning of the internal EU borders. They were still existing and in place and defined the physical space of the member states, but they became much easier to pass for EU citizens who were now allowed to travel and study and work wherever they want within the EU. The idea behind this step was that people should be allowed to move from countries offering only few employment opportunities to countries with labor shortages. And this led to a boost of the economy within the European Union. And it was also the hope that the Europeans would get to know each other better and mix across borders. Regarding migration from third countries, there were a lot of efforts to harmonize policies related to borders of EU member states. Because as you know, migration, the competence of migration is shared by the EU and the EU member states. And of course, every EU member state is free to define its immigration policy. In September 2020, the Commission proposed a new Pact on Migration and Asylum in order to revise and to improve its tools and procedures in the policy area. And in April this year, the Commission proposed a legal migration package aiming at attracting skills and talent to the EU, and also to create safe channels towards the EU. Among others, the package foresees a better protection for migrant workers, because as foreigners who don't know the system, they might be more vulnerable than others. And it makes it also easier to acquire long-term residence status and giving them as such a better protection. Another very important point was the promotion of circular migration in order to combat the brain drain that you mentioned in your introduction. Because it's a matter of fact, when people cannot find employment opportunities, they look elsewhere, they will leave sooner or later. And as partnerships are a mean to structure migration and to influence it. And it was one aim of this package to find partnerships that are tailor-made and that are mutually beneficial, and that would not lead to this brain drain on the long run. Among the new tools, well, is a talent partnership that can be negotiated with, individually with different countries. There's also a new talent pool that will open in the mid-2023. That is meant for skilled nationals outside of the EU who can register, and it is kind of matchmaking platform, and also an EU platform for labor migration. It's maybe important to stress that the member states stay free to decide how many workers they will accept from abroad. But it is also important to stress that the talent partnerships are tailor-made and that they are a matter of negotiations and negotiated reality, so to say. That should be beneficial for both parties and above all for the individual workers. Okay, that's from my side.
Thank you, Mrs. Waiter. Dr. Khouri, I'm not sure if you'd like to comment on anything, or we can take questions from the public.
Let's take questions from the public.
Okay. Do we have any questions? There is a question from my side to you, Dr. Khouri. In your opinion, what type of social cohesion activities can be considered to relieve the tension between Syrian Lebanese and Palestinian Lebanese? What type of social cohesion activities can be done?
Yeah.
You've mentioned in your paper Yes.
This is a good question, because now I'm in Paris discussing a project about sport and peace. There are a lot of activities taking place in the Palestinian camps related to sports. And there is also the integration through schools. But then again, I'm talking, considering, putting aside the political issue. I have someone who's writing his thesis, who is about to start writing his thesis about the Syrian community in South Lebanon. And he's working on integration through schools, because schools actually are they receive a lot of Syrian students, and this is a way of integrating them. Of course, sociology is not really very normative. We try to understand how integration is going on, and I do not know. I am not sure if the Lebanese are all okay with integrating Palestinians and Syrians within the Lebanese society.
Thank you for the honest answer. The second question is related more to the Lebanese community. What are some solutions that can be implemented on the ground in order to remove or minimize xenophobic thoughts dominant in our country, in our society?
As I was discussing my paper with colleagues and friends, we realized that actually xenophobic discourse is one thing, and then the things that we are seeing on the ground is another thing. Actually, we should be pleased to consider or to remarquer, to acknowledge that actually the Lebanese population has very well received the Syrians, and that we have, I do not have the statistics, but we don't have a lot of incidents. People are really very welcoming, even in the regions that were deemed xenophobic to start with, or to be really very honest, the Christian regions, let's say. But I think that somehow the Lebanese have opened their arms to the Syrians, and that discourse is something that emerges when we sense danger. In this way, it is not necessarily a performative discourse. It's not because Lebanese verbally attack Syrians that they do attack Syrians on the ground, because statistically speaking, there has been virtually no attacks against Syrians in Lebanon since 2011. So I think that we should look closely to what a xenophobic discourse means, especially in sociology, because most of the time we say things, but we do not really act upon what we really say. You cannot, we cannot forget the political feud, the way that sometimes Lebanese make fun of the Syrians, of course. But this is this is something that we can find between neighboring countries all over the world.
Thank you, Dr. Khouri. Any other questions?
Thank you very much. Actually, my question is for both researchers. When we look actually at the Ukrainian crisis and the way Europe reacted in welcoming the Ukrainian refugees in comparison to refugees coming from the global south, is Europe actually leading a reflection today about its own xenophobic reactions to brown people entering their borders and the extreme securitization that had accompanied it, and compare it to the way that they have actually welcomed Ukrainian?
Shall I go first? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your question. As a matter of fact, the European Union is welcoming many refugees. I mean, in 2015, when the Syrians arrived, they were welcome. They were, I'd say, accommodated as good as it was possible. It was also the first time that the European Union had to deal with this kind of huge influx. And yes, some measures might be a bit improvised, but they did their best concerning the, well, faced to this kind of circumstances. Another point is that, I mean, Ukraine is neighboring the European Union. It is a direct neighbor. The people don't have any other option than to run to the European Union if they don't want to run towards Russia. So I think this explains maybe the difference in reaction. And by the way, I think the option of what is it called, of temporary protection was also on discussion in 2015, 2016, but the member states at that point did consider that relocation would be the better alternative to welcome the people the moment they cross the border and to relocate them to other member states. And it turned out that this was not working that well, and that's why they opted this time for the temporary protection. Is this an answer to your question, or?
Dr. Khouri, would like to add anything?
Yes. Actually, the question is very interesting, and it reminds me of a sentence that was uttered also by Emmanuel Balibar that I have quoted when he said that Europe is very busy distinguishing the bad immigrant or the bad refugee from the very bad refugee from the very, very bad refugee. And of course, we have listened to a lot of journalists talking about the Ukrainians and saying that they are blonde with blue eyes, and this sort of discourse. But I can also hear my colleagues' argument about Europe being hospitable to the Syrians, because I have witnessed how Syrians have been welcomed in Berlin, in Germany. And I have also had the occasion of talking to the Lebanese ambassador in Germany 2 years ago, and he told me that the Germans treated the Syrians so well that some Lebanese tried to forge Syrian identities in order to go to Germany. So I think that there's an exaggeration from both sides. I think that Europe, some countries in Europe have done a lot of things to the migrants, but I think that the discourse that we have heard in the press was, of course, very much offensive, and that it could lead to such to the remark that we have listened to now.
Thank you, Dr. Khouri. I would like to thank one more question.
Hello. I just wanted to say a little word about xenophobia and the direction in which it is, how it is directed. Because the answer, the question, the way you said it, it goes in a certain direction. And I would like to say that actually with 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, you have you need to check on the police reports, which are very interesting, and you can see how many crimes or minor crimes, the way how much it increased since the beginning of the migration period and since the beginning of the war, and especially the migration period when they arrived, and it has increased by 6. So it was really increased by 6, and this is very interesting because we see that, on the contrary, the assaults come on from Syrians towards Lebanese, and not really the other way around, even though they exist also. So this gives you maybe a certain, certain idea, or gives you, it's a number that can be really relevant in analyzing what Rula has said today about xenophobia being maybe a big word and being really sociologically not really the word to use, or especially knowing the history of Lebanon and Syria. I'm not to try to defend anything, but one has to take into consideration the historic context and the way Rula mentioned it. She mentioned the Christian regions, and I want to tell you something because I've worked a little bit on doing interviews within refugees in the Christian regions. Actually, they prefer to come to the Christian regions because this is where they live better. A lot of them would tell me they live better in the Christian regions, and they prefer not to be in Tripoli, where they are actually more assaulted than anywhere else, like for instance. So you see, there are a lot of things that we don't know and that we need to go on the ground to, and there are many people doing this research, and we maybe need to read more about master thesis and PhD thesis that are being written today, and that unfortunately very little people are reading. And we need to read more about all the work that is being done on the ground, and this is very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your intervention. I think this is the end of our second topic for the fourth panel for today. We'll have a break of 20 minutes, and we will be back at 10 minutes. Let's be back at 5 sharp to discuss with Mr. Mohammed Zbib the third topic for today, which is rising inequalities, with Mr. Mohammed Zbib. Thank you, everyone.